You think you know the story of Dumbo, a little elephant born with ears so large they are mistaken for wings, an outcast, a freak, mocked by his own kind, separated from his mother, forced into the humiliating clown act of a travelling circus. It's a story of finding strength in what makes you different. With the help of a plucky mouse and a magic feather, the little elephant learns that his curse is actually a gift. He learns to fly. He becomes a star. He is reunited with his mother, and they live happily ever after. It is one of the most beloved tales in the cinematic canon, a story of triumph over adversity. But the story you know is a lie. It's a carefully constructed fable, a coat of bright paint slapped over a century-old story of trauma, abuse, and profound suffering. The truth is not about a cartoon elephant who could fly. It is about a real elephant who was taught how to die. His name was not Dumbo. His name was Jumbo. And the story that bears his likeness is not a fairy tale. It is a confession, coded into animation, preserving the memory of a crime we all agreed to forget. Once you understand the nightly rages, the gallons of whiskey, and the sound a freight train makes when it meets 7 tons of bone and flesh, you will never see that flying elephant the same way again. The story begins not in a cartoon circus train, but in the borderlands between Abyssinia and Sudan around 1861. It is a world of heat, dust, and blood. European hunters, armed with rifles, are pushing deeper into the continent, not for exploration, but for commodities, ivory, skins, and living wonders for the parlours and menageries of the West. Imagine a small African bush elephant, barely more than a baby, huddled against his mother. He is all knees and trunk, his skin still loose and wrinkled. He has known nothing but the herd, the scent of the savannah, the deep, rumbling security of his mother's presence. Then comes the crack of gunpowder. The herd panics. Men shout in, a language he does not understand. His mother, like the other adults, forms a defensive circle, but their size is no match for lead. He watches her fall. He watches the men with knives move in. This is the first and most critical piece of the code. In the Disney film, Dumbo's mother is taken away, locked in a wagon for defending her child. It is a temporary, unjust separation. This is a mercy, a profound act of sanitization. The reality for Jumbo was not separation, it was slaughter. His mother was killed before his eyes. He was captured, along with other orphaned calves, by being dragged from her corpse. His first memory of humanity is the murder of his family. This trauma, this primal wound, is the engine of his entire story. He was not just separated from his mother, he was unmade by her loss. He was then sold, and sold again, a piece of living property. He passed through the hands of an Italian animal dealer and a German collector, eventually ending up at the Jardin des Plantes in Paris. He was a wreck, malnourished, covered in sores, his growth stunted. He was a disposable curiosity, and his disposability was killing him. This is where the second character in our tragedy enters. Not Timothy Q. Mouse, but Matthew Scott, a quiet, unassuming man who would become Jumbo's keeper, his confidant, and in many ways, his codependent. In 1865, the London Zoological Gardens traded a rhinoceros for this sickly little elephant. The head of the zoo, Abraham Bartlett, took one look at the animal's pathetic state and essentially wrote him off. He handed him over to Scott with little hope. But Scott saw something else. He nursed the elephant back to health. He slept in the stall next to him, talking to him, cleaning his sores, feeding him by hand. He formed a bond of intense, almost pathological devotion. And the elephant, whom Bartlett had mockingly nicknamed Jumbo, likely a mangling of the Swahili word jambo, meaning hello, or Jumbe, meaning chief, began to thrive. Under Scott's care, Jumbo grew and grew and grew. He became the star attraction of the London Zoo. He was colossal, eventually reaching over 11 feet at the shoulder, a true giant. For 17 years, he was the delight of London. He gave rides to hundreds of thousands of children, including a young Winston Churchill and Theodore Roosevelt. He was patient, gentle, a living monument to the glory of the British Empire, a magnificent beast, tamed and presented for public amusement. This was the daytime Jumbo. This was the public performance. The night was a different story. You have to understand the context here. A Victorian zoo was not a conservation centre. It was a prison. The enclosures were brutally small, concrete and iron affairs designed for human viewing, not animal well-being. Jumbo, an animal meant to roam for dozens of miles a day, spent half his life locked in a cramped, dark barn. His only companion was Scott. His only outlet was the brief, monotonous circle he walked each day with children on his back. The psychological pressure began to build, and at night, it exploded. When the gates closed and the crowds went home, Jumbo would fall into terrifying rages. He would smash his tusks against the iron-plated oak doors of his enclosure, again and again, trying to break free. The sound of splintering wood and shrieking metal would echo through the zoo. An examination of his skeleton decades later confirmed this nightly torture. The head of his tusks were worn down and shattered from the repeated impacts. His bones showed signs of chronic joint pain, the result of standing on hard concrete for 2 decades. This is the truth behind Dumbo's sadness. The cartoon shows a weeping child, ostracised for his appearance. The reality was an adult animal driven to the brink of madness by confinement and trauma. He wasn't sad, he was in agony. He was destroying himself night after night in a desperate, futile attempt to escape. And how did the zoo manage this? How did they ensure the gentle giant was ready for the children the next morning? This brings us to the magic feather. In the Disney film, the feather is a placebo, a psychological tool given to Dumbo by his mouse friend to give him the confidence to fly. It's a symbol of believing in yourself. The real magic feather was far more literal and far more sinister. It was alcohol. To calm Jumbo's nocturnal furies, Matthew Scott would bring him staggering quantities of beer, wine, and liquor. On some nights, it was a gallon of whiskey. On others, it was entire kegs of beer. The alcohol would subdue the rage, drugging the giant into a manageable stupor. The magic that allowed him to endure his life, to fly away from his pain, was chemical dependency. He was a functioning alcoholic, medicated into compliance, so the show could go on the next day. His diet was another source of misery. The children he carried all day would feed him an endless supply of sticky buns, coins, and other debris. When he died, his stomach was found to contain a horrifying collection of objects. Hundreds of English pennies, keys, rivets, even a police whistle. He was being poisoned from the inside out, slowly, day by day, by the very public that adored him. The zoo director, Abraham Bartlett, grew terrified. He saw the escalating rages, the splintering doors, the sheer uncontrollable power of the animal. He became convinced it was only a matter of time before Jumbo broke free and killed someone. An elephant's rage, known as must, was a known phenomenon. But this was different. This was not hormonal, it was psychological. Bartlett saw a ticking time bomb. He decided he had to get rid of Jumbo. But killing him would be a public relations disaster. So, he found a buyer. Enter Phineas Taylor Barnum, P.T. Barnum, the American showman, the titan of spectacle, the man who arguably invented modern entertainment. Barnum heard about the giant elephant in London with a madness problem and saw not a liability, but the marketing opportunity of a lifetime. In 1882, Barnum offered the London Zoo $10,000 for Jumbo. Bartlett accepted immediately, without consulting his staff or the public. The news of Jumbo's sale created an unprecedented national outcry. The gentle giant was a British icon. The idea of selling him to a brash American showman was seen as a national humiliation. 100,000 schoolchildren wrote to Queen Victoria, begging her to intervene. Lawsuits were filed. The newspapers were filled with angry editorials. John Ruskin, the great art critic, wrote furiously of the sorrow of the whole nation. Barnum, a master of public relations, fanned the flames. Every protest, every tear shed, every angry letter was free publicity. He brilliantly framed the narrative. It was not him stealing Jumbo, but Jumbo choosing to come to America, the land of opportunity. The circus had come to claim its star. Just like in the cartoon, Jumbo was destined for the big top, but he did not go willingly. When Matthew Scott and the zoo staff tried to walk Jumbo out of his enclosure to the shipping crate that would take him to the docks, the elephant simply lay down in the street and refused to move. For days, he resisted. Was it a stubborn refusal? Or did the animal, conditioned by years of routine, simply fear this break from everything he had ever known? Barnum turned this into the greatest publicity stunt of the era. He cabled the London papers declaring, "Jumbo, lying in the street, is a better advertisement than if he had gone quietly." The world watched, breathless, as the drama played out. Finally, after days of coaxing by Scott, his one trusted human, Jumbo was loaded onto a massive cart and pulled through the streets of London to the docks. A mournful, epic procession. He arrived in New York to a hero's welcome. Barnum had plastered the entire country with posters. Jumbo, the largest elephant in the world. He was paraded up Broadway, pulled by 16 horses with a full brass band to Madison Square Garden. The greatest show on earth now had its greatest star. The next 3 years were a relentless, brutal grind. Jumbo was a cash machine. He, along with his keeper, Scott, travelled constantly across North America on a custom-built circus train. The shows were endless. The crowds were massive. Barnum paired him with a tiny elephant named Tom Thumb, exaggerating his size even further. He was no longer just an animal. He was a brand, a phenomenon. His image was used to sell soap, thread, and sewing machines. The bond between Jumbo and Matthew Scott remained the one constant in his life. Scott continued to sleep near him, to talk to him. But now, Scott was also on Barnum's payroll. He was complicit in the exploitation. He was the only source of comfort in Jumbo's life, but he was also his jailer. This complex, tragic relationship is flattened in the Disney film into the simple, cheerful friendship between Dumbo and Timothy Mouse. The mouse is an ally, a strategist, a friend with no ulterior motives. Scott was a man trapped between his love for an animal and his need to make a living from that animal's suffering. So, we have the pieces. A stolen child, a murdered mother, a life of painful confinement, psychological torture masked by public adoration, and a dependency on alcohol to survive the night. How does this story end? In the Disney version, it ends with triumph. Dumbo, the star, is given a private, luxurious train car with his mother. He has transcended his torment through a unique talent. He is celebrated for his strangeness. Jumbo's story ends on a railway track in St. Thomas, Ontario, on the night of September 15th, 1885. It was the end of the season. The circus animals were being loaded onto their train after the final performance. Jumbo, along with the small elephant Tom Thumb, was being led along the main track towards his car. It was a poorly managed process. A siding track was supposed to be used, but for some reason, the elephants were on the main line. A signalman made a fatal error. An unscheduled freight train came roaring down the same track, right towards them. Imagine the scene: the sudden shouting, the frantic desperation in Scott's voice, the piercing whistle of the locomotive, the beam of the headlamp cutting through the darkness. Accounts of what happened next are conflicting, coloured by Barnum's relentless myth-making. The official story, the one Barnum immediately began to sell, was that Jumbo died a hero. He claimed that Jumbo saw the train, turned, and deliberately shoved the little elephant Tom Thumb to safety, sacrificing himself in a final act of nobility. This is almost certainly a lie. It is the final act of sanitization, turning a pointless, tragic accident into a heroic narrative. The more likely truth is far more chaotic and grim. In the panic, the smaller elephant, Tom Thumb, was likely struck, first suffering a broken leg. Jumbo, confused and terrified, was hit head-on by the locomotive. The impact was catastrophic. The engine and several cars derailed. The elephant was thrown into a ditch, his skull crushed, his body broken, bleeding internally from 100 wounds. Matthew Scott ran to his side. Jumbo was still alive. He reached out his trunk, wrapped it around the keeper's hand one last time, and then, with a final shuddering groan, he died. He was 24 years old. Even in death, Barnum could not let him rest. The showman's first instinct was not grief, but business. He immediately sent for taxidermists. He had Jumbo's magnificent hide stuffed and mounted on a frame. He had the skeleton articulated and mounted separately. And then he created the ultimate spectacle. He sent both Jumbos, the skeleton and the taxidermy, on tour with the circus. For years, the American public could pay to see the ghost of the great elephant, his hollowed-out remains paraded as a ghoulish attraction. He was more profitable in death than he had ever been in life. So why was the Dumbo story written? The original book, a short novelty item called Dumbo the Flying Elephant, was created in 1939 by Helen Aberson and Harold Pearl. It was a roller book, a toy where the story was printed on a scroll that you viewed through a small box. It already contained the core elements: the big-eared elephant, the circus, the teasing. It was a simplified, softened version of Jumbo's life, which by then had passed into legend. But it was Walt Disney who saw its true potential. His studio was struggling financially after the expensive productions of Pinocchio and Fantasia. He needed a cheap, simple, profitable hit. Dumbo was the answer. Produced on a shoestring budget, it simplified the story even further. The sanitization was a commercial necessity. You cannot sell the story of Jumbo to children. You cannot show a baby elephant watching his mother be butchered, cannot explain the psychological horror of confinement, the nightly rages, the self-mutilation. You cannot animate a story about managing an animal's trauma with gallons of hard liquor. And you certainly cannot end a family film with the hero being obliterated by a freight train due to human negligence. So, the agents of change, Aberson, Pearl, and most significantly, Disney, systematically replaced every element of historical trauma with a palatable, fictional substitute. The primal wound of a mother's murder becomes a temporary separation. The agony of a caged animal becomes the social awkwardness of a shy child. The chemical crutch of alcoholism becomes the psychological placebo of a magic feather. And a brutal, meaningless death is transformed into a triumphant, magical flight to stardom. The motive was not malicious. It was commercial. They were not trying to erase history. They were trying to create a product. But in doing so, they performed a kind of cultural alchemy. They took a story of profound darkness, a story about our own cruelty, greed, and ignorance, and laundered it into a story about hope. The name itself is the final, cruelest joke. Jumbo, the chief, a name of power and stature, was twisted into Dumbo. The insult hurled at the cartoon character, Dumbo, was a posthumous degradation of the real animal. His very identity was turned into a slur. Dumbo is not a bedtime story. It is a crime scene, preserved in the amber of animation. It's the story of a living being, ripped from his home, imprisoned for profit, driven mad by loneliness, pacified with drugs, and worked to death. The enduring power of the film isn't just in its charming animation or its simple message. It endures because, on some subconscious level, we feel the weight of the truth behind it. The profound, bottomless sadness in Dumbo's big blue eyes is not just a cartoonist's trick. It is a faint cultural echo of the real pain of the animal he represents. The story operates on two levels: the bright, cheerful one we are sold, and the dark, spectral one that haunts its every frame. The story of Dumbo is not about learning to fly. It is the story of how we cage miracles and then sell tickets to watch them break.